Okay, so lately I've been getting a lot of comments wondering how I color grade my footage to make it look filmic, and today I thought I would just break that down, show you the super simple method I use to make my footage look as cinematic as possible in the easiest and fastest way. So let's jump into it. Alright, so I'm going to show you 3 different examples, but let's just start with this one. As you can see, this is S-Log3 straight out of my Sony camera, and it's super flat. If we pull up waveforms right here, as you can see, it's just super compressed right in the middle as you want for that good dynamic range, but it doesn't look great obviously. So the first thing I do is I put an adjustment layer just over my clip, and if I turn this on, you can see that my LUT applies basically most of my look. I really love these LUTs. They're called the Phantom LUTs, and a lot of people know about them, but they just give a great image. And basically I just select this one. I like Eastman and Vision the most, but if I just select between those two, I basically just select one of these two, and my image is looking pretty dang good. The colors are just really nice. They're punchy and they have style, but they're relatively neutral enough that it's not a super intense look, so I love it. And then another really cool thing about these LUTs is that if you go into your exposure adjustments, let me just add another color wheels right here. If I bring down the exposure, you can see it won't go below clipping. It won't go below 0. So it stops at about 3 IRE. And then if I bring it up to the top, you see it can't clip over 100. So if I go up here, it basically stops it at like 98. So that's just a super cool thing these LUTs have built in, basically stopping you from overexposing your image. But now let's look at what else I do to this image. So if I actually go into the same adjustment layer with my LUT in it, what I'm going to do now is add a color curves. So if I go into this color curves, you can see I basically added 2 different points here and then brought down the highlights a little bit. So if I turn it on, you can see it brings down the waveform. So in the highlight section, instead of being at like 98, it brings them down to about 90 IRE, which basically just makes it look a bit more filmic. I actually went ahead and analyzed a bunch of film stills from actual movies and looked at their waveforms, and I found that most of them, even though you technically can go to just under 100 without being overexposed, most of them, their highlights are under 90 IRE and their shadows are above like 3 or 5 IRE. So you really don't push it right to the edge in most cinematic movies, and some are even much lower. Next in color, I went into the clip I actually shot and I started to adjust some exposure things here. So first thing, I added some color wheels just for some minor shadows and highlights adjustments. So if I turn it on, you can see I basically just expand the contrast a little bit more, make it a little bit more contrasty, bring those shadows in the waveform just down a little bit, make the shot a little more punchy. The next thing I do is draw a mask around the skin tones to check the exposure as well as the color. So if I just turn this on real quick, you can see I've just highlighted a little section here. And if I actually look at my waveforms, you can see that my skin tones are sitting around 68 IRE, which is a pretty good spot. You want them between 50 and 75 generally for good exposure. But now what I'll do with this same mask selected is go into my vector scope to see where the colors are lining up. And as you can see right now, it's a bit more on the yellowish or green side. So if I turn off the mask, you can see that my skin tones are a bit green, and that's not super desirable. So basically what I'll do is I'll add some hue and saturation curves. So if I select into this, you can see for my hue versus hue, I've added a bit more pink to the image. So if I turn this on, you can see my vector scope, it goes from that yellowish to that more skin toned aligned with this line right here, which represents skin tone. So if I turn that on, you can see it goes more in that direction. And if I turn off the mask, it changes the skin tones from that greenish look to a bit more pink, which personally looks way too pink to me now. So I'm gonna dial that in with some more color wheels. So if I turn this new color wheels on, you can see what it does to the image. It darkens everything and makes it a bit more moody. So if we look at what's actually going on in the colors, you can see I've brought the global colors down to a more greenish or blue look, which is kind of associated with that cinematic look. So if I turn it off, you can see what it does. And to compensate for that, what I've done is basically added the midtones to a bit more reddish. So to bring back that skin tone, so looks like that. Here's without this color wheel and here's with it. So you can see it just makes it a bit more contrasty and a bit more stylized. And then on top of everything, I just added some grain, some 35mm film grain, and that's the entire shot from start to finish. Here's the beginning frame and here's the final frame. Pretty simple color grade. Okay, so now let's move on to this second shot right here. As you can see, it started out in S-Log looking like this, super flat obviously. If I bring up waveforms, you can see it's a pretty dark shot all below like 65 IRE, so in the shadowier side. And if I just start to apply what I did to this, you can see how things change. Again, this one is very simple. Basically what I'm gonna do is apply my Phantom LUT, which in this case is Vision. And as you can see, we're pretty far along our way. I mean, this just looks so good. So I'm just really happy with that look. And from here, I mean, I look at my waveforms and I'm like, that looks pretty good. My top is like at 82, which is pretty cinematic in terms of a top exposure, and then my lowest is down at like 2. So really a pretty dang good exposure just by applying that one LUT, mostly because I tried to expose as good as I could in camera, which really helps. But again, just these LUTs are fantastic. But from here, I wanted a bit more contrast, so I went into my color wheels and I added a bit more shadow, brought it down, and raised the highlights up, which resulted in a shot that looked like this. So just a little bit more contrast, a little more punchy, and makes it a bit more saturated. On top of it, I did apply a bit of a bloom to the highlights though, to try and simulate some of the Pro Mist look. So if we zoom in right here, you can see without it, it's a bit harsher, and with it, it just softens all those shadows. So just a little bit of a touch there to make the image look softer overall. And on top of that, I added some film grain, of course, just to add that little grainy touch to the shot. I think this one it's 16mm. Then I added this frame look just to make it look a little bit more vintage and interesting. And on the edges of it, I actually added a prism effect. So if I turn that off, you can see I basically made a prism to make it look like that chromatic aberration you might find from older lenses. So a little bit of a stylistic look, but here's the before shot and here is after. So for the final shot, let's look at this one right here. So if we just stop the frame right here, you can see this is a shot in S-Log3, super flat as always, but let's start applying our effects. So first of all, again, gonna add that phantom LUT. In this case, again, it is Vision 3. So if we look at it, that's with Vision 3. I'm not a huge fan of how this turned out in this shot. It might be because it was slightly overexposed or something, but it just has a pretty greenish look and I don't love it. So this shot, I definitely tweaked things the most. Above this clip, I actually added an adjustment layer with a color curves, basically just to bring down those highlights. So in the background, just bringing those down a tiny bit on the waveforms just so they're not quite as bright. And if we go back to the main clip, next you can see I added a color wheel. So if we look at that, basically I just brought the shadows way down, the highlights up, and the midtones up a little bit. So basically I just made the shot a lot more contrasty, and from there you can see it just looks so much better. From here I added another color wheels to stylize the shot a little bit. So if I apply this, you can see I basically made it a bit more red and pinkish just to make it a bit more fun looking, but I noticed that my skin tones were a bit too red now, so I did the mask effect again. I drew the mask over some skin tones and looked at my waveforms. As you can see, they're sitting at around 57, which is pretty decent exposure for skin tones. And if I look at my vector scope, you can see that they are tinted towards magenta, so they're a bit on the pink side. So what I did is I added a hue and saturation curve, just a super basic curve towards green on the hue, basically just moved over those colors just a tiny bit more centered. So if we turn off the mask, you can see that the shot is looking pretty dang good from without effects to with effects. It's come a really long way, but from here I just wanted to add a little bit of style in the corners, so I turned on some prism just to prism out the corners here and add that, again, fringy look that you might find on older lenses. So just a little bit of fun look there. And then on top of everything, I applied some 60mm grain, of course, just to add in that look even more. If we zoom in, you can see that grain off and on, so it looks really good. I love that effect. And I added those 4x3 bars on the side just to make it look a little bit different. So here's the before and here is the after. So with that being said, that is my super basic and quick, like 5-minute color grading process to pretty much all of my clips for more quick projects. I think it looks really good. It's mostly due to the LUTs being just fantastic, and then just minor exposure changes here and there. I know I showed this tutorial in Final Cut Pro, but for bigger, more professional projects, I definitely use DaVinci Resolve to color grade my projects, but the general idea is still pretty similar. But anyway, that's it for today. If you like this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe down below, and I will see you all next time.